Yes.
Okay, I'm Peter Michael from the University of Tulsa, and I've been studying degassing of mid-ocean ridge basalts for a while, and I think they might shed some light on magma degassing on Venus. Can we see the slides yet?
Yes, we can. But it needs to be full screen though.
We're working on it.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Do you see them?
Great, I can see it now, thanks. Next slide, please. So the samples that I will concentrate on come from Kolbeinsey and Reykjanes ridges that are north and south of Iceland. And they're from about 150 meters water depth to 3,000 meters depth. And that corresponds to a pressure of 15 to 300 bars, which brackets Venus's atmosphere, which is at about 40 to 90 bars. So in this diagram, the orange color is for the shallower 40 bars, and the turquoise colors are around 90 bars. And you can see we have samples that are both deeper and shallower than that. And if you look on the right side of the diagram, the basalt in the picture shows the basaltic glass that forms when it quenches against seawater. This glass is remarkable stuff because it preserves the dissolved volatile contents that are present in the silicate liquid phase. And it's relatively easy to analyze it by electron microprobe, FTIR, ion microprobe, and you get the liquid phase composition. And if we want, we can also get information from the vesicles. Next slide, please. The most important results that I have to show you today, I think, are from sulfur. And so the decrease in solubility of all the volatiles with decreasing pressure means that all of them may be exsolved from an ascending magma into bubbles. Carbon dioxide is the least soluble, so it exsolves into the bubbles first, followed at some point by sulfur and water. So the question is, how shallow is the degassing of water and sulfur? And we know that CO2 starts pretty early. But even before sulfur exsolves and enters the bubbles as SO2, you can see the bubbles on the vesicles in the magma on the upper left photograph. Even before that happens, though, the magma is, the silicate liquid is saturated in an iron sulfide immiscible liquid. And you can see that in the lower photographs. The left side is transmitted light, and there's a tiny spherical blob of sulfide liquid, an immiscible sulfide liquid that you can see in reflected light in the right-hand photograph. And the equilibrium between the silicate melt and the sulfide melt, between sulfur and oxygen, gives us, and it's an iron silicate melt, it's an iron sulfide melt with the silicate melt. It gives us this equilibrium, and that gives us this fantastic correlation between dissolved sulfur with weight percent iron oxide. And that's the purple dashed line. I've only shown the data for Reykjanes Ridge and the purple dots there. And so those are for the purple dots, and the dashed line are for the deeply erupted samples that we presume have lost no sulfur from degassing. And it corresponds to a lot of other deeply erupted samples. But you see, as you get to shallower samples on Reykjanes Ridge, that the shallower you get, the more you are displaced below that sulfur concentration. And so we define this this value called delta S, which can be considered as the sulfur that is lost by degassing, how far it falls beneath that line. And I should tell you that the data for iron and sulfur come from my laboratory, or the open symbols for Reykjanes Ridge, as well as the Kolbeinsey samples. And there's an unpublished study by Forrest et al. That is all of the Reykjanes samples that are the filled symbols. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I have on the y-axis is the collection depth. So that's pressure, and it's increasing downwards. So it's like you're looking into the ocean. And I'll be plotting it this way in subsequent graphs as well. And just remember that water depth is 10 times the pressure in bars. And so the pink box shows the conditions of Venus's surface in terms of its vertical extent. And so this graph shows how sulfur degassing starts at about 1,000 meters depth, the bottom of the pink box on the right. And it goes up to a shallower pressures as well. And so this is a sort of the most important finding of the study, is that degassing of sulfur starts at these pressures, which was not predicted by earlier studies. On the right side, I show the equilibrium CO2 contents that are still dissolved in the liquid. So the CO2 is mostly dissolved at much higher pressures in the crust or mantle at this point. So the CO2 contents go from about 183 ppm at 4,000 meters down to very low values when we get up to Venus conditions. So the next slide will actually show a blow up of this slide on the right. And on the left is the model slide from the very excellent study by Gaillard and Scalet. It's a very good conceptual study, but it's not as accurate as it needs to be for talking about Venus. On their diagram, on the left diagram, pressure now is on the x-axis. So I'm sorry that you have to compare x-axis and y-axis here. But the pink box is still Venus conditions. And you can see with the model, starting on the right-hand side of the diagram, and an ascending magma would be going from higher pressure on the right to lower pressure on the left, that the red line shows you the sulfur remaining in the basalt. And basically, the model predicts that more than 99% of the sulfur would remain in the basalts. Now, I should also mention that the melt initial concentration in their model is very similar to what we are using and measuring in our mid-ocean rigid basalts. So you can see on the right diagram is the basalts that we measured, and there's a red line in the box, the thick red line in the box, and that shows that model result. It basically shows the amount of sulfur lost by degassing, and it's only about 5 to 15 parts per million sulfur lost by degassing. We're measuring 300 or 400 parts per million sulfur lost by degassing in some of the samples that were erupted under Venus conditions. Certainly lower amounts on the plains and higher amounts from whatever peaks might have erupted. But at any one pressure, we're measuring about 20 times as much sulfur loss as their model would predict. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oops. Hello?
Next slide, please.
Oh, next slide, please.
Yeah, we're trying.
Oh, okay. Okay, so one of the questions I asked was, can the higher water in the mid-ocean ridge basalts account for greater sulfur degassing than predicted by the model? We had up to 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% in some of the basalts. And so what I've done is I've color-coded, this is the same diagram as 2 slides ago, but I've color-coded the glasses by water content. What you can see is there's very little difference between dry basalts, which have less than 0.2% water, and basalts that have about 0.5% water. So the conclusion is that under, for the dry magmas, under Venus conditions, the water content is not what's strongly influencing the sulfur degassing. So this is an actual expectation that we would have for Venus magmas. Next slide, please. We can compare the amount of CO2 and SO2 amounts that are degassed. And so I'm starting with an initial CO2 content of 600 ppm. And that would be, say, from a magma chamber that's 3 kilometers deep in the crust, and that's the kind of gray-blue glasses on the right, on the left-hand side diagram. And you can see that it's the amount of CO2 that's degassed is increasing very, very slightly as you ascend through the Venus conditions range, but the amount of SO2 is increasing. The important thing, though, is the CO2-SO2 ratio, and you can see that it is not a huge number, and that's because there's a significant amount of SO2 that's being degassed. So typical ratios that we might see, mole ratio or mass ratio, are in the range of 1 to 2 or something like that. So significant amounts of sulfur are being degassed relative to the amount of CO2. Next slide, please. We also looked at water degassing, and concentrating now on the right-hand diagram because it's the lower water concentration. Using volatile calc, we modeled that only about 10 parts per million of water is lost, starting with 2,000 parts per million, or 0.2%. Only 10 ppm is lost at 90 bars, and 30 ppm is lost at 40 bars. So more than 99% of the water is retained in the magma. Next slide, please. And this is borne out by what we found when we used water cerium ratios to estimate the pre-degassing water content of the basalts. It's pretty imprecise method, not as precise as the modeling method, but we found similar results. The regional average of water cerium ratio for undegassed basalts is about 290 ppm. Next slide, please. And so the amount of water that was lost using this method is also very low. Next slide, please. So basaltic magmas that are degassed along shallow mid-ocean ridges that are going to predict the following for magma degassing on Venus, and that is that sulfur degassing could make significant contributions to Venus's atmosphere, perhaps 100 to 300 parts per million sulfur, which is 10 to 30% of the magmatic sulfur that would be degassed by sulfur-saturated magmas directly, and that significantly exceeds some of the models. Secondly, if magmas rise from crustal or lithospheric depths, their CO2 contents are going to be relatively low. They would have lost their CO2 in an earlier stage if they had it to begin with. And the CO2 to SO2 ratios might range from 1 to 2. Interestingly, for these low water basalts, we start to see sulfur degassing before water degassing, and the amount of water that's degassed is fairly low, less than 30 ppm for Venusian magmas. Thank you.